Welcome everyone, good morning, good evening and good afternoon. Today is Saturday. We are in the middle of the weekend and we have to update our overview of Mythic Plus that we looked at last time, I think 11 or 10 days ago, something like that. It's time to go and look at the update because through this time we have gotten a couple of rounds of nerfs to the dungeons. In particular, we have gotten nerfs to Grimmail Depot, Iron Docks, and the two Karazhan dungeons, and we have gotten back-to-back nerfs to the Infiltrators, to the Dreadlords of the Seasonal Affix have gotten nerfed twice. This was the recent of the nerfs is this one. The health has been reduced by 10 to 20% depending on your average item level. The damage has been reduced by 17% on their melee swings and abilities, and Vampiric Claws, so the heal of the Infiltrator, is happening 50% less often, from an 8-second cooldown to a 12-second cooldown. So now we have gotten yet another round of nerfs in Mythic Plus, so let's just take a look at how things have been going in Mythic Plus so far. There have been, I'm just gonna give you the spoiler before we go through all of the different roles, there is one major change across all of the roles, but let's just start with the tanks first. So, compared to last week, we continue, to no surprise, to have a very high percentage of players staying with Blood Death Knight. This is not a surprise because, of course, the Blood Death Knight has not been nerfed at the start of Season 4, unlike DESTRO and unlike Survival Hunter, Blood DK and Holy Priest, the other two members of the gang of high Mythic Plus keys, they were not nerfed. So of course players have continued to play Blood Death Knight just fine. The only slight thing worth mentioning is that Protection Paladin is getting a few more plays here and there, especially in the very highest of keys. You now see a handful of Prot Paladins in the top keys, in the 28, 29, 30 keys. It's a sea of red because it's mostly Blood Death Knight, but there is a handful of Prot Paladins. Prot Paladin is one of the two tanks that was buffed at the start of Season 4 together with Protection Warrior. Obviously, Protection Warrior was a little bit too far down in power to rise by a lot really, so they are still not very played whatsoever, but Prot Paladin, on the other hand, was already quite strong, so now you see a handful of Prot Paladins pretty high up in the rankings in Mythic Plus. The difference with healers is mostly the same because we still have the duo of Holy Priest and Restoration Shaman. The difference to Season 3 is true in Season 4, which is that now it's actually more Holy Priests compared to Resto Shamans. In Season 3 it was more Resto Shamans, but in the very highest of keys they were played by Holy Priests, mostly because of power infusion really. But now in Season 4 is starting with Holy Priest already being considered the strongest, so players are already quick on the take, on knowing that Holy Priest is the strong one, so now they are slightly ahead. To be fair, to be perfectly honest, I expected a little bit more of a lead of Holy Priest over Resto Shaman because of how much more prominent it is when it comes to the MDI, when it comes to the great push competition and the high level of Mythic Plus. It's basically just Holy Priest, so I was expecting that from the crossing of Season 3 into Season 4 more players would have moved to Holy Priest, but no, looks like Resto Shaman is still very popular overall in high keys, and then you have Resto Druid. The other three healers have remained quite low. As we said, they haven't truly gotten buffed at the start of Season 4. They are not really getting anything new, anything shiny, so Holy Paladin, Discipline Priest and Mistweaver Monk are not really in the picture when it comes to Mythic Plus high keys. We then have the melee DPS. Now this is a little bit interesting. We left the melee DPS pointing out that after the nerf to survival, they were still ahead, they were still the number one of the specs you want to bring in Mythic Plus, but compared to last season it wasn't nearly as dominant because Outlaw, which had gotten buffed, has been growing a little bit more because Windwalker was also buffed and is now growing a little bit more as well. So now in Season 4, in the third reset of Season 4, Survival is still the more popular. It is still the leading DPS spec for melee, but you know, Outlaw is getting quite closer in terms of popularity, so is Windwalker. They are pretty healthy in their numbers in high keys. The surprising one is when it comes to the actual top runs, when it comes to the actual pros and very high keys, it's perhaps actually worse than Season 3. Because now the answer, very often, the answer to Destruction being nerfed and to Outlaw being buffed very often becomes to simply bring double Survival Hunter to your keys. One of the highest keys completed in time, the first I believe plus 30 completed in time was completed by a triple Hunter, a triple Survival Hunter comp, for example, and there are plenty of double Survival Hunter comps right now without a Destruction Warlock, for example. So despite the nerf, funnily enough, because this is what happens when you keep giving compensation buffs when you nerf Survival. Survival was nerfed a couple of times, but every nerf that came through also buffed their single target in return because of a supposedly needed compensation buff. So the result is that they still kept the best AoE of melee DPS even after it was nerfed, but they significantly increased their single target potential because of the buffs, which have now made them perhaps even stronger overall in Mythic Plus. That's pretty unfortunate. Still though, there is also plenty of Outlaw Rogues and Windwalker Monks towards the very top. Now, I said we were going to see one major change in Mythic Plus, and this time it's in the range DPS. Remember the good old times, or perhaps for you the nightmare of Destruction Warlock being 53% of all range DPS in Mythic Plus keys. Now the number has gotten much lower, of course. Last time we looked at this 10 days ago, it was still very dominant, right? It was above 30%, so it was very clearly the strongest one. What is the change now? The change now is that we have gotten more and more over time, more and more Demonology Warlocks to take over Destruction. There is a quite significant rise to the point that, given the trend, by next week we might even see Demonology take over Destruction. Now, there might be multiple reasons for this. There is still very strong AoE for both Survival and even Windwalker. You also now have Outlaw, which is very strong in AoE, so perhaps a more single target focused, a more CD single target burst focused spec like Demo might be more useful than Destruction after Destruction was nerfed in its AoE damage. Now, what is worth mentioning, however, is that even though Demonology is still rising significantly across this last week, you can basically only chalk it down for the low end of the very high keys. What happens when you start getting into the very high keys is that you will see Destruction Warlocks. So Demo is growing and is getting much more represented, but not in the 30, 29, 28, 27 range where it is still completely dominated by Destruction Warlocks. The only other interesting thing for the range DPS is that while all the other specs lose popularity, they are played less comparatively. The only two specs that grow across the board besides Demonology are the two Hunter specs. Both Beast Mastery and Marksmanship are now more popular than when we looked at last time. So this is our overall rankings taken from Subcreation for the keys past Keystone Master, from the plus 16 all the way up to the plus 30 range. Looking at the results, we see quite obviously Blood Death Knight being the absolute best, with a series of other tanks all just meddling in the middle, and Guardian Druid right below all of them. When it comes to healers, it's pretty much the same thing we have seen, not just now, not just last week, but for perhaps the entirety of Season 3, really, which is Holy Priest and Resto Shaman at the top, followed by Restoration Druid and Holy Paladin, and then at the very bottom, Mystery Monk and Discipline Priest. Unsurprisingly, the melee DPS keeps the trio of the popular specs Survival, Outlaw and Windwalker. Once again, not to discourage too many players, the reason why Subtlety and Assassination are both at the very, very bottom is because all of the better rogue players, all of the more competitive hardcore rogue players are playing Outlaw, which means only casuals and less serious, less competitive players are left playing the other two rogue specs, which also results in quite poor performances from these two specs. For the range DPS, we have the change that we mentioned. We have Demonology making it up into the S tier together with Destruction and with Fire Mage already there. We haven't mentioned we haven't talked about Fire Mage actually, because they haven't really moved. They haven't really grown more popular or less popular, but it's worth mentioning that as we were talking about the composition of groups in the highest keys, Fire Mage is also one of the more seen specs. It's not in all groups, it's not going to be a 100% presence like Survival Hunter is, but it's definitely popular. You know, in the top 100 keys in Mythic Plus right now, there are 40 Windwalker Monks, 35 Outlaw Rogues, and 33 Fire Mages. So it is still one of the other choices once you go past Survival and the second Survival, or Survival and Destro. Then the last spot is very often a split between Outlaw, Windwalker, or Fire Mage. So Fire Mage is definitely into the S tier together with Destro and the Surprise Demonology for this week. So pretty much the main change for range DPS has been the growth of Demonology for this week. Now, we finished the week with the dungeons. We are in a tyrannical week this time. It's explosive, which is quite nice. It can be annoying, sure, but it's not that much of a disaster. And bolstering, which is definitely much more annoying. And compared to last week, compared to the last time we looked at this, we have a few differences. You know, you change tyrannical, fortified. There are major differences in how the dungeons can run, depending on that type of affix alone. What doesn't change, however, is that the two Tazavesh dungeons are still amongst the easiest ones together with Mechagon Junkyard. Workshop, well, Workshop this week has gotten a little bit nastier because of the difficulty of bosses in a tyrannical week. Grimrail Depot and Iron Docks don't change too much. Grimrail gets a little bit easier because of the bosses, which are slightly easier, especially after Skylar Tovra has been nerfed by making it easier to dodge the mechanics. What also doesn't change, unfortunately, is the difficulty of both upper and lower Karazhan, which remain at the bottom of the ease tier list because of how tough they are. It can be quite easily demonstrated by the distribution of keys completed per dungeon level that you can see right here. You see Tazavesh dungeons being quite prominent in terms of completion, you see Mechagon dungeons being quite prominent, and then you see less and less, in particular lower Karazhan being by far the least completed dungeon, followed by upper Karazhan. This is the numbers version of the completion list. Upper Karazhan never even passes the 10% range, and lower Karazhan, once you get past the +10, doesn't even get above the 5% range, which is quite tragic. However, it has just gotten nerfed this week, so perhaps it's gonna get better over time with the set of nerfs the dungeons received. Now, with this being said, this was our entire recap for this week of Mythic Plus. The major change when it comes to specs has been the growth of Demonology Warlock for the range DPS, as well as the funny side effects of double nerfing Survival, somehow, some way ending up with groups taking double or even triple Survival Hunters in Mythic Plus keys, which is, well, I guess not what Blizzard intended when they were nerfing Survival, but that's where we are right now. Now, with all of this being said and done, we can now leave each other to the rest of our Saturday. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of my Patreon supporters. A round of applause for all of them, allowing me to continue to produce content for you guys. Of course, I am still, in case you were worried, don't despair, I am still the president of the No Alpha organization. That is not going away anytime soon, apparently, but eventually, I hope, I will be able to push out even more content for the beta of Dragonflight. For now, however, this is what we have. Now, of course, you can also like and comment down below on this video to help me even more, together with subscribing to the channel itself, which is kind of the goal for YouTube channels. And for final ultimate social simping behaviors, you guys can follow me on Twitter right over at this link, together with subscribing to my Patreon. This is all for today. I'm gonna leave you to the rest of your Saturday. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, so according to the plans, I think next week the Demon Hunter talents come out in the alpha build, and then either we get one final full alpha build, or right after that we get the beta being released for Dragonflight. I think that's the plan.